minutes. I see that our live stream has started, so we can officially kick off. Once again, I'm Leigh O'Neill. I'm the Director of Legal Advocacy at the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism. And I am very excited to be hosting this time here with all of you today. Thank you for joining us to hear about parental rights and choices in education in 2025 and beyond. We'll be talking about what families can expect under the leadership of the new administration. And I am extremely delighted to have these two amazing panelists with us here today, Corey DeAngelis and Kerry McDonald, both powerhouses in their respective fields. And I'm really excited to hear their take, the background, their experiences that have brought them into these topics and made them experts, and hear, what they think that we can expect, the good, the bad, and the ugly. So I just want to go ahead and start by introducing them and giving their bios and backgrounds a little bit more thoroughly. So again, we have Corey DeAngelis. He's a senior fellow at the American Culture Project. Some of you might know him as the school choice evangelist, as he's been called. He's also been called the most effective school choice advocate since Milton Friedman. He's a regular on Fox News and frequently appears in the Wall Street Journal. He's the executive director at Education Freedom Institute and a senior fellow at Reason Foundation and an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute. He's also a board member at Liberty Justice Center, and he's going to share some exciting news that came out of that organization a little bit ago, and also a senior advisor at Accuracy in Media. He has a Ph.D. in education policy from the University of Arkansas, and he is the national bestselling author of The Parent Revolution: Rescuing Your Kids from Radicals Ruining Our Schools. We also have Kerry McDonald here. Kerry is a senior fellow at the Foundation for Economic Education, where she leads the Education Entrepreneurship Lab and hosts the Liberated podcast. She's also the Valinda Johnson Family Education Fellow at State Policy Network and an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute as well. She's a regular contributor at Forbes.com and The 74. Kerry is the best-selling author of Unschooled: Raising Curious, Well-Educated Children Outside the Conventional Classroom, and the author of the forthcoming book, Joyful Learning: How to Find Freedom, Happiness, and Success Beyond Conventional Schooling. Her interests include homeschooling and schooling alternatives, self-directed learning, education entrepreneurship, parent empowerment, school choice, and the family and child policy. Her articles have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Post, Newsweek, NPR, Education Next, Reason Magazine, Washington Examiner, City Journal, Entrepreneur, and the Journal of School Choice, among others. She has a master's degree in education policy from Harvard and a bachelor's degree in economics from Bowdoin College. Those are very impressive publication lists. I think that I am very envious of and hope to one day accomplish like a single one of those would be fantastic. So thank you both so much for joining us and for sharing your experiences and takes on how everything's about to unfold. Is everything going to change? Is everything going to change? What's going to happen? Before we get to talking to Corey and Kerry and hear from them directly, I just wanted to sort of frame up this webinar and why it's something that's of interest to FAIR and FAIR's supporters. So again, I'm the director of legal advocacy, which means that I field and kind of triage different incidents that come into FAIR from people who have experienced potential, civil rights violations, free speech violations, all of the sort. And since I started at FAIR in 2021, certainly the incidents that have been coming out of schools have been very alarming in different ways. And parental rights have been, I would say, very much threatened in many different ways. And it's always been very important to us at FAIR to work to uphold that critical partnership between schools and families, parents and students. And that's been a real challenge that I think that there's been a lot of tension over the past several years, given the different initiatives that have rolled out through schools, the way that discriminatory diversity, equity, and inclusion practices have proliferated institutions and schools. Certainly, radical gender ideology has had some of the same impact. I would say that the issues that most commonly have come to FAIR in the parental rights space have had to do with radical gender ideology. I'll never forget the first time someone explained to me what a gender support plan was. I was horrified to learn that many school districts actively hide information about their students from parents. We have fielded requests for legal assistance from teachers who have been told that they have to blatantly lie to parents by, changing the name that they use to refer to students, the pronouns. And, there are significant civil rights concerns relating to a lot of the different topics that have really come up over the years. And it's really, I think probably both Corey and Kerry will both speak to this, but it's really created this sort of heightened emphasis on school choice and what other education opportunities do families have to look to if they disagree with the path that their school is going down. I'm happy to answer any questions about what FAIR has dealt with, throughout the course of this webinar, but I really want to, spend the bulk of the time hearing from Kerry and Corey about their experiences, and what they see coming down the pike. So, Corey, if I could start with you, I was hoping that you could give us an overview. First, kind of tell us about your individual background, your personal experiences, like why are these issues ones that you're so passionate about and you've, jumped headfirst into these, and are focusing your time and attention on them. And if you can give us an overview of the Expanding Educational Freedom and Opportunity for Families executive order that was published on January 29th, that would be great too, because I think that'll help shape, another big part of this conversation. So please.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I got into this movement as a researcher. I did my Ph.D. in education policy at the University of Arkansas. So you can call me doctor if you want, but you probably shouldn't. I'm not a real doctor. I'm more like a Jill Biden doctor. I can help you with math and maybe some other education related stuff, but I can't help you with the real things. But no, my first study at the University of Arkansas linked the Milwaukee Voucher Program, a school choice initiative that started in 1990, to a long-term outcome that I thought was pretty important, that was not really well researched in the literature, which was reducing crime later on in life. We followed students by the time they were about 30 years of age, compared to the kids that that similar demographics in the public schools, they were much less likely to commit crimes. Lo and behold, you get a better education opportunity if you have a better environment throughout K through 12 education, then you're probably going to be less likely to be involved in the criminal justice system. Since then, there's been 6 peer-reviewed studies. I've done 2 of them linking school choice to crime reduction. So it doesn't just benefit you academically, it benefits your character, and it can benefit these longer-term outcomes that are more important, I would say, than a standardized test score. I thought I was going to go into academia. I figured out really quickly that was not a friendly home for me. Most of the peers in the peer review process were actually enemies. They were 99% of them are Marxist who disagree with me on my main policy issue of school choice. Even though I had to go against a lot of my enemies in that process, I do have about 40 peer-reviewed articles. But I ended up going to Cato Institute, which was my first think tank. I'm affiliated with a bunch of them now. I'm at American Culture Project full-time now. But growing up, I also went to government schools myself. And I had the opportunity to go to something called the magnet school in high school, which is a form of school choice still run by the district or the government, but you're not assigned to it. So they have an incentive to cater to the needs of their customers. They have to attract their customers. They don't just get the money for you to go there just based on where you live, and basically you have no recourse in the public school system. I also started as a economist. I did my bachelor's and master's in economics, where I saw all the problems of monopoly power, which is entrenched in the government school system. If you don't like what you're getting, and look, we saw this over the past few years with parents who were upset about CRT and gender ideology during the COVID era. They saw this through remote learning, through Zoom school, which was a disaster in so many ways, but it revealed to parents that the schools weren't aligned with their values. When they pushed back at the school board meeting, what happened? They were labeled as domestic terrorists. I mean, that could help if you make your voices heard, but from what we've seen is that a monopoly, if they don't have an incentive to listen to you, they're going to label you as an evil person. They're going to try to bully and silence you. They do still. They turn off people's mics. They don't care about the parents. They see the parents as an impediment to their agenda to molding the minds of other people's children. They think they own your kids, and that's the main problem. But school choice provides a competitive incentive for them to actually care about you as a customer as opposed to an enemy. So getting to, look, Trump won the parent vote by 9 points, first of all. This was a 15-point shift to the right since 2020. So the GOP has basically emerged as the parents' party. And 2 polls right before the election by Atlas Intel, the most accurate pollster in 2020 and 2024, nationwide, found that Trump was actually beating Kamala Harris on education in both instances. And this basically never happens for Republicans. And it begs the question it raises the question of why. And I think it's because this has changed from a conversation about who's going to throw more money at the problem to who's going to trust parents to direct the upbringing of their children. And I think Trump was the obvious winner when it comes to parental rights and education. He campaigned on school choice. He campaigned on abolishing the Department of Education, very popular issues. And now we're winning so much, I'm almost getting tired of winning. It's almost hard to keep track with all the executive orders and people that he's appointing and confirmations that are going through the Senate. The Republicans have a trifecta, meaning they are in control of the House, the Senate, and the president's office. And so they have a mandate to pass universal school choice, or at least move the ball forward on that issue and try to abolish the Department of Education as well. Trump has already issued an executive order to expand education freedom. It's basically a school choice executive order. I wrote about it at the American Institute for Economic Research. I'll put the link in the comments in a second. But basically, my main takeaway is it's a step in the right direction. It puts wind at the sails of the school choice movement, but it's not sufficient to unleashing education freedom for everybody. And why do I say that? So the executive orders can only do so much. We have limited powers of the executive branch in the United States of America, for better, for worse. When it comes to empowering families with education freedom, it's kind of a downside, but we really like to limit the executive branch for when they want to overreach and take our rights away. But this executive order from Trump does basically 3 things. The first thing is that it directs the Department of Education, which will be Linda McMahon once she gets confirmed through the full Senate. She's already made it out of committee on a party line vote with all the Republicans in favor. I think it was a 15-14 vote. She should have the votes on the floor. So Linda McMahon, I hope you get in there and body slam that unconstitutional Department of Education once and for all. It'd be fantastic. But this executive order directs the Department of Education to use any discretionary funding that's left over to use to expand school choice initiatives. Well, I don't know how much discretionary funding is actually available to move to school choice initiatives, and it doesn't actually, 100% require or guarantee that that's actually going to happen. He's putting someone in place who does support school choice. So I think that's likely to happen, but it's not really clear at this point how much that's actually going to move the needle, how many additional scholarships kids are going to have to go to private schools. It's up in the air right now. The other 2 parts of the executive order are pretty interesting. One is to direct the Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, to look into how to advance school choice for military families. Military families are already sending their kids to schools that are funded by federal dollars. So this is basically directs them to try to reshift those dollars to say, hey, instead of you having to go to the government-run school that's funded through federal dollars as a military family, you should be able to take that funding to a private school too. So again, I don't know when that'll happen, how many families will be affected, but that is the direction that things are going. And then the last piece, real quick, is that it directs the Secretary of Interior, I believe Doug Burgum, to look into Bureau of Indian Affairs schools, which have very low test scores right now. They're doing really horribly, funded with federal dollars, directing them to come up with a plan to have more school choice for those families too, which then raises the question of, well, where do we go from here? And so the next thing that Congress can do is something called the Educational Choice for Children Act. This is a nationwide school choice initiative. It's not federally funded. It's a tax credit So you can get a tax credit for donating to a scholarship organization on your federal taxes. And then families can go to that scholarship granting organization to get the scholarships to go to a private school or a homeschool option or any other option other than your assigned government-run institution. I think that's a step in the right direction too, but it's capped at $10 billion in tax credits. So that's limited in the number of students that it can help as well. They've estimated about 2 million kids could benefit from such a scholarship program. But guess what? We have like 50 or 55 million kids at the K-12 level right now in America. So, that's not a very significant percentage. It will be helpful for those 2 million kids, obviously, but most of the magic needs to continue to happen in the states. I live in Texas. Our House just released their bill to go all in on school choice yesterday with 76 co-sponsors, just enough votes to clear the chamber. The Senate already passed the bill. Trump has made very good or effective use of the bully pulpit. He pressured the Texas House to pass a bill. Now we have the votes to do so for the first time in Texas history. 13 other red states at least have passed universal school choice in the past 4 years. We've had more advancement on school choice in the past 4 years than in the preceding 4 decades. It's been a lot of good news on the school choice front, but it's because the teachers union stepped on a rake. They hit themselves in the face because they showed parents what was happening in the classroom. And when parents said, I'm going to push back, I'm going to do what you always told me to do, go to the school board and you'll listen to me like you said, parents found out that that wasn't a very effective strategy in most cases. Sometimes they did. Sometimes you can win school board races, but the unions have a lot of power and numbers and funding to consistently win those school board races. So they're in control of the government-run school system. That's why we need to give them a reason to listen to us instead of cutting our mics off. So I think we can leave it there. There's other executive orders too about ending radical indoctrination in schools. There's executive orders about pulling federal funding if they teach CRT, if they have COVID vaccine mandates for kids or the teachers, they get their federal funding pulled. And I think these are all steps in the right direction if you believe that CRT is bad, that it divides kids based on immutable characteristics. If you think gender ideology is bad, this is another step in the right direction. But before we move it over to Kerry, I will just say, even if these are necessary changes from the top, they're not sufficient because in my home state of Texas, where we've banned CRT, they're still doing it. They're still doing it. They're calling it something else. They'll say, oh, well, we'll just move the goalposts, say it's social emotional learning, or we'll just say we'll teach the concepts, but then we'll just say, no, we're not teaching CRT. That's a legal term used in higher education. It's not in the schools. But guess what? There's an Education Next survey that just came out this year, nationally representative survey, finding that 36% of students reported in high schools that their teachers often or almost daily said that America is a fundamentally racist nation. That crap needs to get out of the schools. I'm glad Trump is taking steps to eradicating it. But at the same time, if they're still going to do what they want behind closed doors and it's a never-ending game of whack-a-mole, we need school choice too. And so I'm glad Trump is doing both of these things.
Thank you. I think so much of what you said will resonate with people who are watching and joining us here today. And I understand that the bulk of the school choice issue, it looks like it's going to have to be taken up at the state level. You mentioned a few initiatives at the federal level that might be helpful. And I just had a couple of quick questions to follow up on that before we go over to Kerry. So you mentioned the military project and also the Indian Affairs dollars. Do you have any idea about how many dollars are at stake there and kind of what's the volume, and can that money be filtered into that scholarship initiative you mentioned in order to establish better school choice opportunities, at least for those populations?
Yeah, so if they pass the Educational Choice for Children Act, that would be stackable with other school choice initiatives. So in Florida, for example, you can take, $10,000 or so per student to a private school. You could add the few $1,000s that would come from the Educational Choice for Children Act, stack them to attain to make it more affordable to go to a private school that may be out of reach with the 10,000. Same thing with the Bureau of Indian Affairs schools and the military kids. I don't know what the specific number is on what they're funded at right now, but that certainly is something that could happen. And I will just say on ECA, it is supported by the Speaker, Mike Johnson. President Trump already said he would sign it. And the Senate President, or Majority Leader, John Thune, Republican, also said he would support the bill as well. Real quick, we have another.
Are there sponsors on that bill yet, or has it been introduced?
Yes.
Where is it right now?
We already passed it. It was the first nationwide school choice bill to pass out of a congressional committee. That's never happened. It happened last October, about a month after I testified before the House Ways and Means Committee in favor of it. And it was a party line vote, all Republicans in favor. I remember when I was testifying, the minority leader, the Democrat on that committee, said to me that I was making it too partisan, that Democrats support school choice too. And so I responded to him and said, you're right, it shouldn't be a partisan issue. Democrats support school choice. Voters, they have their kids in charter schools. They send their kids to private schools with scholarships in Florida. Democrats, independents, Republicans alike, they benefit from this. The problem is the Democratic Party is a wholly owned subsidiary of the teachers union, which don't represent the interest of Democrat voters. And so I asked him, I said, well, it would be great if you would sign on to the bill, be the first Democrat to do so. He didn't take me up on my offer for some reason. But there's a separate bill by Senator Mike Rounds in Congress. His name is a Republican out of South Dakota. It's called Returning Education to the States Act. It would abolish the Department of Education. I think that would be a huge win. And we can talk about whether that's likely to happen or not in a second and what the bill actually does, but I don't want to filibuster too much, which is something that has to do with that bill as well. But the Educational Choice for Children Act does have most of the Republicans in both chambers signed on to at least one version of it. So it has a lot of support. It's on the Republican Party platform. They have majorities. There's no reason why it shouldn't pass.
Any intel on when it might pop up and sort of spring into action this term?
Hopefully sooner than later, but I think the real plan is because there's a filibuster issue that Democrats could. So for listeners, if a bill is filibustered in Congress, the Senate needs 60 votes to stop the filibuster. And Democrats before, when they were in power, they were talking about ending the filibuster. All of a sudden, they don't want to do that anymore for some reason because they're not in power anymore. But Republicans, I don't think, will vote to end the filibuster. I think they're, in line with the Constitution and limited forms of government. So I don't think they're going to do that, even if it would empower them to do more. But we don't have 53 Republicans in Congress. We don't have 60. We have 53. And so the plan is for the school choice bill to go through the budget reconciliation process, which means you wouldn't have to override a filibuster. So that's the most likely way it's going to happen. It'll be packaged into a tax bill or something to get it done. So we'll higher likelihood of it happening.
Yeah. Okay. Got it. So turning over to Kerry, one of the other pieces that we wanted to talk about is kind of, what we've seen over the past several years that I think has really amplified parents' distrust, mistrust in public schools, kind of the need and really this heightened, awareness about school choice even being a possibility. If you could give us kind of your background and experience, also what got you into these issues and the work that you're doing now. And then also if you could talk about the way you see the ending indoctrination executive order, and especially, how that deals with parental rights, like in terms of, FERPA and the PPRA, issues like that are addressed, that would be great.
Thanks, Leanne. So glad to be here. I appreciate the invitation and always great to be with Corey. I'm a big fan of Corey's, so nice to share the stage today with Corey. Like Corey, I started as an undergrad in economics, and that was really my entry point into education and education policy because I had a hard time understanding why we had and have so much choice, variety, and abundance in so many areas of our lives, but in education, we don't. And I was an undergrad in the late 1990s, so there was much less choice, variety, and abundance then. And I began to sort of peek under the lid a little bit and sort of see why this was, and discovered that it was really because we have this monopoly system of government-run schooling that limits entrepreneurship and innovation and the variety of choices that we have, again, in so many other areas of our lives. So that's what ultimately led me to graduate school in education policy at Harvard. This was sort of the early 2000s. Anyone at the time who was interested in education choice, at least from my experience at Harvard, was sort of focused on charter schools, which were coming on the scene in many ways at that time. And I ended up teaming up with the Pioneer Institute for Public Policy in Massachusetts, the free market think tank here in Boston, where I'm based. And they were really doing some great work to incubate some charter schools in those early days and really encourage the charter sector to be those incubators of innovation and experimentation that they promised to be at the time. So that was sort of my entry point into education choice and policy, but I still felt like we were missing out on, more innovation in education, schooling alternatives and different ways of approaching teaching and learning. So I became really interested in the homeschooling community and ended up choosing to homeschool my own children, and wrote a book, as you mentioned, Leanne, in 2019. It came out called Unschooled: Raising Curious, Well-Educated Children Outside the Conventional Classroom, that really looked at the growth and diversification of the modern homeschooling movement and the emergence of the microschooling movement. And of course, a year after that book came out, we had school closures and remote learning and all kinds of chaos resulting from the COVID response. And that really accelerated my work in identifying what parents were looking for. I think at the time, a lot of parents really were able to, for the first time, recognize that there were other options besides their assigned district school, and that maybe their district school wasn't serving them as they had hoped. And so they began to realize there's this whole other world that they could tap into, and their demand for these innovative education models grew. And then entrepreneurial parents and teachers recognized that demand and began creating more and more of those solutions. So various types of low-cost private schools and micro schools and homeschooling collaboratives and high-quality online learning platforms, all sorts of things really began to take off. And so I've spent really the last 5 years documenting these education entrepreneurs, the vast majority of whom are former public school teachers. In my twice weekly Liberated podcast, where I interview these founders of these schools and spaces, 75% of them are former public school teachers who grew disillusioned with the standardization and one-size-fits-all nature of government schooling and felt that they could do something different and better. And so they're going off to create these new schools and learning models. It's just such an exciting time in American education. Certainly the most exciting time, I think, in the 20 plus years that I've been doing this work. And because parents now have that choice and they are increasingly exposed to so many possibilities for their children's education, and that's being accelerated by school choice policies, as Corey mentioned. Now we have 33 states plus District of Columbia and Puerto Rico that have some version of private school choice. We have universal school choice in about a dozen states. Corey mentioned Texas, really on the brink of what would be the largest launch of a universal school choice program in the country's history. So there's so much to be excited about, so much for us to be applauding in terms of school choice policies. But, and this is where I'll take a bit of a more contrarian view, I argue that we shouldn't be applauding federal school choice policies or, federal education policies in general. We should be pushing back, I believe, on federal education policies, even if we like them. Let's remember that there is no constitutional role for the federal government in education, which is why the U.S. Department of Education should be eliminated. And as Corey sort of touched on, the only areas in which the federal government could arguably have any influence in K-12 schooling are in the District of Columbia, in schools overseen by the Department of Defense and the Bureau of Indian Education. Everything else constitutionally should be left to the states. And in fact, Linda McMahon made this point in her confirmation hearing recently, explaining that she intends to help President Trump return education to the states where it belongs, is what she said. So, I think that the key is really to reduce the size and scope of the federal government's role in education, not to enlarge it. And even when we support certain programs or policies, such as school choice, we should speak out against the implementation of these policies at the federal level, including the recent school choice executive order. But I know that, Leanne, you wanted me to talk more specifically about Trump's second recent education executive order on, quote, ending radical indoctrination in K-12 schooling, which I think is similarly problematic. By activating, as Trump does, the U.S. Departments of Education, Defense, Health and Human Services, the order aims to end federal funding for schools that promote, quote, anti-American, subversive, harmful, and false ideologies on our nation's children. And that would be specifically related to race and gender. So, as with school choice policies, K-12 curriculum and content decisions should be a state issue, not a federal one. And, just prior to the 2020 presidential election, I wrote an article at the Foundation for Economic Education, which is the country's oldest libertarian think tank, founded in 1946, where I'm a senior fellow. And this article, again, in September of 2020, was entitled, "If You Don't Want a Biden 1619 Commission, You Should Oppose Trump's 1776 Commission." I argued then, as I do today, that the federal government should not be in the curriculum business, and that constitutionally states are the ones to grapple with these issues. And yet in this new executive order, Trump is resurrecting the 1776 Commission and pushing for obligatory patriotic education. So some could argue, that the federal government is already entangled in education policy. There's already funding coming from the Federal Department of Education, although it's less than 15% of total K-12 schooling spending. So you could argue that they're already involved, even if they shouldn't be, and therefore this influence on curriculum in K-12 schools is justified. But I think we should, use the current strings of power to enact change, not to enlarge the federal government's role in education. The current administration has promised to shutter or at least shrink the U.S. Department of Education, which is admirable, but I think that these executive orders go too far in actually moving against that belief. And I'll actually say that recently NPR came out with an article sort of challenging Republicans. They say, Republicans are sort of saying they want to get rid of the U.S. Department of Education on one hand, but then on the other hand, they kind of like having the power to do what they want with it. They're sort of speaking out of both sides of their mouths here. And I think they're right about that. I think, we have to be sort of true to our principles. I think some parents and voters might be thinking, well, it's okay while President Trump and the Republicans are in power, if we be excited about these curriculum changes and ending indoctrination and national school choice policy. But I think we need to be aware that, what happens when the political winds inevitably shift and the Democrats are again in charge, and now you've emboldened the federal government with this power. And I don't know that that's really where we should be. So I believe that we should, be directing our energies toward advocating these state-based school choice policies that enable families to exit and assign district school for other options that may be more aligned with their personal values and their children's needs. And, I talk to families and founders kind of on both sides of the political aisle who've left public schools for other options because they didn't like what they were seeing in their schools, whether it was they didn't like what they saw as gender ideology and discussions about sexuality for young children that they didn't think were appropriate. And so they left to find a school or space that was more reflective of their family values and their preferences. Or on the other side, families in states that have passed these so-called CRT bans who felt like they couldn't have honest and open discussions about race and culture and history in public school classrooms. And so they similarly pulled their kids out of those public school classrooms to join private schools and other homeschooling collaboratives and programs that, again, were more aligned with their preferences and values. So I guess, sort of to wrap up, I would say, at the state level, we should push for expanded school choice policies that enable more families to choose just the right school or learning environment. Again, that's aligned with their family values and needs. And at the national level, we should push for a constrained federal government that doesn't control our lives or those of our children.
Thank you.
Yes.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Corey.
So real quick, I think I agree with Kerry's philosophy on everything. I think the problem is that conservatives have taken this approach for a long time because they don't want government involved in education. And so they've just kind of taken the back seat. And the problem is that the Democrats then get to dictate what happens in the schools, either at the local level or at the federal level. Whether Trump does something or not through executive order or through Congress, the Democrats still could pass whatever they want in a future Congress. It doesn't depend on what Trump does today. And this might be why the schools are controlled by radical Marxists right now, because the conservatives have always said, well, you know what, we don't want to be involved in education. But the problem is there's no such thing as a content neutral school or a curriculum neutral school. Someone's going to determine what's happening in that school. And I think the radical left has figured out they don't even have to have their own kids anymore. They can just infiltrate the government-run school system and mold the minds of other people's children. And while I agree with Kerry that the government shouldn't be involved in education at all, really, especially not at the federal level, when we take a back seat, I'm just concerned about who's going to step up and who's going to have their values instilled in those classrooms. And what's happened for a long time is it's been the teachers union, special interests controlling the Democrats who have shaped policy. So I think we agree philosophically, Kerry. I got into this as a libertarian too. I think the government school system is the most socialistic institution we have in our country today, and it's the most harmful because we're dealing with young children's minds that teach them that big government's the solution to all their problems. But I think where we disagree is just implementation, and I guess just we agree on what utopia should be, but we don't agree on how to move in a direction towards having parents be in charge of their kids' education.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say, we should be moving away from government coercion toward individual choice. And the way I think that happens is by encouraging education entrepreneurship and a free market of education that has very little government involvement, so that parents really are able to choose just what they're looking for, the way we are in again, all other consumer choices. So we're not forcing other people to eat at the restaurants or shop at the stores that we prefer. We recognize that we all have, very diverse preferences and needs, again, in these other consumer choices. And I feel like we need to have that same viewpoint in education, moving away from coercion, so that nobody, no politician, no American president can impose their view on individual families, that's up to us.
Yeah, I think the other thing is, you pointed out, I think NPR had said that conservatives are calling to eliminate the department, but then they're also using the department to do other things. I think the reality is that conservatives might know that they don't have the votes to end a filibuster in order to eliminate the department altogether. There was even whispers in Politico and other media outlets a couple of weeks ago about Trump potentially doing an executive order to abolish the Department of Education, which would be fantastic if he could actually do that through executive order. But the conversation was that, first of all, they think he plans to do it after Linda's actually confirmed, because it would be kind of awkward for him to do an executive order like that before Linda actually gets confirmed. But that it would be a two-step procedure. One part of it would kind of say in the short term how you could reduce the influence of the department without actually more of a death by 1,000 cuts approach as opposed to just getting rid of it altogether. And then the second part of the executive order was rumored to be about, if we do have the votes to get rid of it, here's how we actually do that. And here's where we want Congress to go. And I think it acknowledges, from what I've heard, that you need Congress to get rid of the Department of Education because it was created by an act of Congress. But maybe that's why conservatives are kind of taking this multi-pronged approach to say, yes, we would like to abolish the department. Trump ran on this, but if we're not going to do that, maybe we can do X, Y, and Z. And I think that's kind of the approach that they're doing. And then as far as the federal school choice bill, I just want to reiterate real quick, it doesn't use any federal dollars. It's a tax credit. So you can abolish the department. This program is neither run nor regulated by the Department of Education. And so he could do both of those things at the same time.
I think the conversation, I really, the article you raised, Kerry, about, conservatives kind of talking out of both sides of their mouths about the DOE, that really resonates. We see endless examples of like the DOE being used because it has the purse strings. It's what triggers compliance with Title VI, Title IX, all the things. And that's great when, you want compliance with those laws. So I think it's a really interesting paradigm there, looking at the different pieces of that conversation. And on the idea of the DOE being dissolved, if, let's say, I agree, I think it takes an act of Congress to do that because it was created by statute. Where do the dollars go then if that happens? And what mechanism can be used to the extent that the money now is being spent in the DOE and it is filtered down into the states to cover things like Title I, all these different initiatives that help kids who need help. How do you reroute the dollars in the right way so that, everyday Americans don't lose, whatever benefits they might be getting from federal tax dollars going into the DOE?
So the main bill in Congress isn't actually as transformational as a lot of the left is trying to pretend that it is. They're trying to pretend it's a huge deal that's going to destroy everything. Maybe some libertarians would prefer it to be that way. But the bill in Congress that has any serious support right now is by Mike Rounds, a Republican out of South Dakota, called Returning Education to Our States Act. And it's basically in line with what Trump campaigned on, which is you take the money that already exists at the federal level, you get rid of the Department of Education, that's gone. The 4,400 or so employees that work there, gone. And that money that was being spent at the federal level would go to the Treasury. The Treasury would block grant that funding back to the states based on the number of students you have. So in Texas, for example, we have 10% of the nation's K-12 students. They would get 10% of the funding. And it would very broadly need to be used for education. You couldn't use it for roads. You couldn't use it for other things, policing. Maybe if the policing was for school safety or something. But it would be very broadly defined to be used for education expenses, and any other things that are thought of as necessary that happen under DOE, the Department of Education right now, would move under other departments, including student civil rights protections would move under the Department of Justice. The Pell Grants would move under the Department of Treasury. Student loans, Department of Treasury. Special needs programs for kids with disabilities would move under the Department of Health and Human Services. So not a lot actually changes. It just provides for more local control. The states would be able to figure out how to spend that money as they see fit. I think the most local level of control that there is the control of the parent. The family unit, as Vivek Ramaswamy says, is the strongest form of governance known to mankind. And perhaps they could amend the bill to make the funding contingent upon you having universal school choice in your state. But that might be too much. California probably would never get any of their funding back, but maybe this would give them an incentive to actually enact school choice in a state like California. But the current bill does not have that stipulation. It's just send the money back to the states, let them figure it out. And which raises the question, Trump campaigned on this too. He said, states like Iowa would get better because they have good people in charge of their systems. What about states like California and New York? He implied that those ones might get worse, but I don't know if they can get any worse than they're doing right now. So I don't think there is much of a downside.
Well, that raises another interesting question, and I'd love to hear from both of you on this. So one of the issues that I've worked a lot on through FAIR is the proliferation of ethnic studies, especially in California, is really kind of the main focus. And I wonder, I guess, Kerry, I'll ask you first. What do you think is like the local enough or the appropriate level for decisions about education choice? Because I mean, to kind of what you were just saying, Corey, if it's all left up to the states, then you wind up like, if California AB 101 is set out to require ethnic studies as a graduation requirement because of forces at work behind the scenes, that is very much, I mean, overwhelmingly, the majority of those ethnic studies courses are liberated ethnic studies courses. They are, riddled with critical race theory and oppressor and oppression, characteristics and all of the terrible things that, all of us would take issue with. So what do you think is the appropriate level of decision-making, as it relates to government, if any at all? Like, how do you kind of solve for that potential political issue that always interjects?
Yeah, so I mean, education policy at the moment, should be at the state level, constitutionally. I would argue that we should have a full separation of school and state. That the ultimate decision lies with parents and families of how their children are educated, where and with whom. But right now, the way the apparatus is that each state can and does set education policy. So we can certainly, argue about curriculum and content at the state level. That's where these arguments should be. That's where the persuasion and conversation should be. But I think that a more sort of empowering approach is to embrace this free market of education, to encourage freedom of exit and choice for families. That's sort of fundamental to a free society, is that if we don't like something, we have the freedom to leave. And right now, again, with state education policy, parents are required to send their children to an assigned district school under a legal threat of force, thanks to compulsory schooling statutes that began here in my home state of Massachusetts in 1852. And you're only able to really exit for things like homeschooling or other forms of private education if you have the capacity to do that and financially are able to do that. What school choice does is enable that choice for all families, regardless of their ability to pay. And many of the new schools and spaces that are being created, certainly the ones that I spotlight, are very low cost. They're, again, started by entrepreneurial parents and teachers who know that they can do education better and are really responding to the needs and preferences of their communities in a whole variety of ways, right? So that really families are able to pick the kinds of spaces that are right for them.
Didn't Horace Mann homeschool his own kids?
He did.
Yeah. Government's compulsory schooling for everybody else because the masses can't figure it out, apparently, according to the elites like Horace Mann. He's the father of public education for the audience. So in Massachusetts.
One of the I think one of the arguments that I've seen in opposition to education choice, school choice principles is this idea that if there is the power taken away from kind of big government, that necessarily the urban schools who service the most, vulnerable students who have majority minority populations will really bear the brunt of that. They will see, the greatest decreases in quality of education. The outcomes will be worse. I want to give you each the opportunity to tell me why that argument's wrong, if you think so.
Yeah, those kids will benefit more than anybody else because they're stuck in the worst failure factories that we call public schools. Look in Chicago, they have about 33 government-run schools that have, guess what, 0 kids proficient in math, 0% math proficiency rates. Zoom over to Baltimore. They have 40% of their high schools in the government school system with 0% math proficiency rates. They spend a ton of money. It never leads to any better outcomes because it's the definition of insanity, doing the same same thing over and over again. It goes, that money doesn't make its way into the classroom. It goes towards administrative bloat, superintendents who are making hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. It gets funneled to the teachers unions bosses like Randy Weingarten, who make over $500,000 a year. And guess what? The kids don't know how to read. They can't do math. And so we shouldn't trap kids in those failure factories any longer. In Chicago, where they spend about $30,000 per student per year, their teachers union boss, Stacey Davis Gates, she knows the benefits of school choice. She sends her own kid to a private school that costs half as much as what it takes in the government schools that she won't send her own kid to. It's school choice for me, but not for the hypocrisy. And when it comes to this argument that it's going to, take away money from the public schools, the money doesn't belong to the government schools in the first place. Education funding is meant for educating children, not for protecting a particular institution. We should fund the student, not the system. And by the way, why would giving families a choice defund the public school if it's doing a good job? The problem is they know they're failing. They know that families do not want to stay in there anymore. And who's the people? Who are the people who are trapped right now? It's the lowest income who don't have the funding to be able to pay twice, to be able to pay through taxes and then also out of pocket for private school tuition and fees. So school choice is also an equalizer because it allows more families to access educational opportunities than the ones who can just afford to pay out of pocket for private school tuition and fees. So this is a big step in the right direction, and it also provides competition. Those kids who remain in the public schools for whatever reason, their outcomes get better. It's a rising tide that lifts all boats. We saw this play out in Florida, where they have universal school choice. As they've expanded school choice over the past couple of decades, their public schools used to be at the bottom of the pack on the nation's report card in math and reading. Guess what? Now they're ranked #1 in Florida on U.S. News and World Report's education rankings, and they spend 27% less than the national average per student. So it's not a money issue, it's an incentive issue. And when you're in this one-size-fits-all system that by definition will never meet the individual needs of diverse parents who disagree about how they want to raise their kids, you're not going to listen to those families if you're in a monopoly. And so, as we've seen in Florida, it's a win-win solution. It's not just the kids who get a chance to vote with their feet. It's the kids who remain for whatever reason. Their public schools start to allocate more dollars into the classroom. They start to pay teachers more. They start to focus on the basics as opposed to radical ideologies. They start to have better discipline policies, have safer environments. And so this is an improvement on both sides, not just in the private sector. And I don't want anybody to think this is a public versus private battle. This is about choice. And I think Kerry agrees with me on this issue and most other issues, that if there's another public school that's doing a good job, you should be able to pick that too. Not all private schools are better than all public schools. This is about choice, not private versus public.
Yeah, Kerry, what do you say on that point? And also, like, if there are, let's say you're a parent in a district where there aren't great independent school options near you, the public school's failing, and it feels like this insurmountable task. Like, I need my kid to learn how to read and do math. And I mean, what are my options? Like, can you, give your thoughts on that kind of general opposition argument, but also what resources do you recommend for families if they're in a state where they do have this flexibility? Where do they turn? Who do they look to?
Yeah, great question, Leanne. And I completely agree with everything you just said, Corey. That families need to pick what's right for them, and founders are increasingly creating the schools and spaces that these families want. To the earlier point about sort of urban districts that might have really low performing standardized tests and so forth. The founders that I talked to, many of whom were working in urban districts, one of the reasons that they left was because they felt like they couldn't make change. They felt that their students were trapped in these failing schools, and they believed that they could do something different, better, cheaper. And so, to that point, certainly in states that have robust school choice policies. I think about Florida and Arizona, particularly because they've for a long time had robust school choice policies. families really are able to leave the district schools for one of these low-cost private education options, whether it's a low-cost private school or a micro school that might serve homeschooling families up to 5 days a week. Families are leaving to go to these programs that, again, in many cases are created by founders who realize the flaws of the traditional system. So I think your second question, Leanne, is even more important is, what if I'm sold that I want something different for my children, but I don't know where to go or what's available? I think the first thing to think about is that you might be surprised at what is actually in your backyard that you don't know about. This movement towards decentralized, innovative education that's affordable and accessible to more families is happening all across the country, as I document in my new forthcoming book, Joyful Learning. It's happening in states with school choice policies and in states without school choice policies. It's certainly happening faster in states with school choice policies, but it's everywhere. And so, I always encourage parents to join Facebook groups and parenting groups in your local areas, homeschooling groups as well, even if you're not necessarily looking for a homeschool specific program, because that's where a lot of this experimentation, innovation is occurring, and you might be surprised to find something that is close by that you didn't even know existed. And then if you still can't find something, I would say, again, the vast majority of the founders that I interview on my podcast are people who couldn't find what they were looking for and decided to go build it themselves. And certainly that's the case for many parents who looked around and tried to find something else and said, there's just nothing that I really want for my kids, so I'm going to go ahead and create my own.
And real quick, I'll point the audience to something called the School Choice in America dashboard by EdChoice. If you just Google it, School Choice in America dashboard, you'll be able to look at your state and see if you have any school choice programs already. I'll give you a quick hint. If you're in a red state, you're more likely to have one or more likely to have one very soon, like my home state of Texas. But I think Kerry's onto something here with this idea of these alternative forms of learning, because a lot of people just think about private brick and mortar schools or charter schools or other public schools, but the union is really afraid of micro schools right now. And during the COVID era, when the government-run institutions were closed, families started to flock to basically a one-room schoolhouse in their house called, they were calling them pandemic pods at the time, where you had 5 to 10 children getting together in a household to economize on the process of homeschooling. And so much that there was a micro school founder named Kelly Smith in Arizona, and they're in other states too, but I think they're very, very prevalent in Arizona. They're called Parental micro schools. The NEA, the largest teachers union in the country, actually put together an opposition research sheet on that organization because they saw they were bleeding students to these alternative forms of education, to the factory model of schooling. And families like it, right? They see that they're getting the benefits of homeschooling. They're getting, also to be able to socialize with other kids as well. And they're more affordable because you don't have as many of the fixed costs. And if you're in a rural area, a lot of people might say you might not be able to have school choice if you live in a rural area. That's one of the arguments they made in my home state of Texas for a long time for Republicans who would vote against school choice. They'd say, I'm still a Republican, but I'm going to vote against my own party platform issue of school choice. Why? I'm going to have my cake and eat it too because I live in a rural area. But the bills now have moved from the voucher conversation, which is something that could only basically be used at a private school, to education savings accounts, which is what's on the table in Texas right now, where you could take the funding for your kid to a private school if you want, just like a voucher. But you could also direct it to a micro school. You can use it for homeschool curriculum, private tutors, any education expenditure. You can't, use it for frivolous expenses, but it has to be used on education broadly defined, which would include homeschool types of education as well. So this is a way to expand school choice in rural areas too. You might not be able to build a new brick and mortar school right away, but maybe you can set up a homeschool co-op or or maybe just homeschool your own kid and they don't have to really go anywhere else.
Well, I think that resource you pointed everyone to in the chat is great, and thank you for that. I know we're at 1 o'clock Eastern now, and I know that we have a hard stop, and so there are a couple of questions we didn't get to, but I will direct those to you guys and hope that you can help answer if you don't mind, and we'll get the answer over to the people asking. And I just want to thank you guys again, Corey and Kerry. Thank you so much for joining us. This has been so informative and just a really great discussion, and glad that so many were able to join us and listen in online as well. So thank you both so much for being here. And I hope that, we'll have the chance to collaborate again in the future. Really appreciate having you guys. And thank you all for attending.
Thanks.